Hello, hello. Hello. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the NAC. Show of hands, first time here? Anybody? First time at the NAC? Great. Well, we're so happy to have you. The old Niagara Falls High School. I'll just read the mission of the NAC so everyone's aware. The Niagara Arts and Cultural Center. We're here to protect the historic building, preserve cultural heritage, and promote visual and performing arts experiences to our community and the visitors to the region, including you. So we're so happy to have this event tonight and get this theater back in business. So I just wanted to invite you to follow us if you'd like to see what other events we have coming. Take one of these home with you today. Follow us on the socials and follow us on Facebook. We have events a week from, this coming Sunday. We have a World Music Festival outside on the lawn with Slime Boots Orchestra coming and having a whole Afrobeat band with jugglers and airlists and fire dancers and a lot of music. So bring your dancing shoes. It's at 2 o'clock, second Sunday. So we would love to see you there on Sunday outside. And tonight we are inside. So right now we'll just have Angela come up and give it up. Thank you for being here, everybody. Sit back, relax. Silence your phones. There you go.
Hi, everybody. I think I know a bunch of you, so thank you for coming tonight. And I was going to just wing it, but my high school public speaking teacher's here, so I hope you know. And hopefully my face is switched like it did at the Emory's. So Mr. Cotton and I just realized that we started chatting about this evening in 2020. I was sitting at my dining room table worrying about things, and this wonderful gentleman reached out and said, I do these Olmsted presentations, and the anniversary of his birth is coming up, 200 years on April 26th. I'd be happy to come to Niagara Falls. So I said, tap the brakes, give me a little bit of room, and let's get in touch in 6 months or so. And long story short, here we are. Western New York is blessed with so much of Olmsted's legacy, especially Niagara Falls State Park. Well, he didn't design it, he influenced the design, and so we're proud of that. And that's why we're proud to be here tonight sponsoring Mr. Cotton's presentation, along with the fine folks at the NAC and the Buffalo Olmsted Conservancy. Just a very special thanks to Kelly Lang and to David Ripple for their help in setting this up, and to NAC board member Frederick for her help in securing the space and conceptualizing this evening. So without further ado, Lawrence Cotton is currently based in Portland, Oregon, a city that benefits from an Olmsted master planned park system. He originally hails from Boston, renowned for its Olmsted landscapes, and is home base for generations of landscape design practitioners working for the Olmsted Brothers firm. A practicing public historian and writer-producer of historical films for PBS, Mr. Cotton was trained as a cultural anthropologist and brings that lens to bear on much of his work. He has worked with the tribal populations throughout the Columbia River watershed, and has also worked on open space acquisitions and the designs of parks and trails in the Pacific Northwest. He also brings his training as an interpretive naturalist. He's a birder and a photographer, and now a lover of Niagara Falls. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks very much, Angela, and it's really thank you for that introduction. It really is a pleasure to join you here at this fascinating facility. And I actually wasn't aware that, in fact, this is the first event of its kind, with, I guess, a public lecture as such. I hate to use that term here in the COVID era, or the soon-to-be post-COVID era. So it's a particular pleasure to join you this evening. And it's also good to know that there are people with us indeed here in the Niagara Falls area who are interested in the name Olmsted. Now, how wonderful it was, in fact, to be spending a half a day at least, not and overnight, but this afternoon we were at the park, and we rambled from our hotel all the way to Goat Island and explored pretty much most of Goat Island and the various views of the falls from the island. Did visit the new Cave of the Winds visitor center. We actually didn't do the Cave of the Winds experience. We've done that in recent years, but what a wonderful new visitor center. If you haven't yet been into the introductory experience of Cave of the Winds, it's the interpretation on the walls, and then of course the multimedia presentation in the second hall that you move into is really quite extraordinary. So I commend New York State Parks for what they've accomplished there. Now, and indeed, you're right, it was a few years ago now when we first started talking about hosting this program here. I do have a bit of a special feel for Niagara Falls and really the greater Buffalo area. After all, it was WNED Buffalo Toronto that sponsored our PBS film. More about that in a minute. By the way, I hope most of you recognize this. I don't always explain it at the top of the program, and I realize that I should do so. This is the famous portrait, almost life-size portrait, of Frederick Olmsted, painted by John Singer Sargent for George Vanderbilt to display at Biltmore. Of course, as you will hear shortly, some of you know this, Olmsted was the designer of the landscape at Biltmore, but this hangs very prominently there if you ever do a tour of the Biltmore home or house, the largest private home ever built in America. If you ever do a tour of that home, you cannot miss this extraordinary John Singer Sargent canvas of Olmsted. Now, indeed, April 26, 2022, let's see if we can get this working. Yes, April 26, 2022 did mark the 200th birthday of Frederick Olmsted, and communities across the U.S. have been ready for this, not just this past spring, but really this entire calendar year. It's a year-long commemoration to commemorate the legacy of all the Olmsteds. There were 3 key Olmsteds, the father and the 2 sons, in the Olmsted Brothers landscape architecture firm. My plan is this, in the time we have. I will review Olmsted's life and career, then I will explore the Olmsted legacy across North America, including Olmsted Sr., we'll be referring to him as Sr., and his 2 sons. And then we'll spend a little more time focusing on the Olmsted landscape legacy in the Great Lakes and the upstate New York. Now, I don't come to you as a specialist on Niagara Falls, okay? I have been there a few times, but I don't come to you as a specialist at Niagara on the history, the unique history here. I know I'm in a room with individuals who are far more informed as to that unique history than I am, and I dare say I can learn a few things from you. But I will talk briefly about the Olmsted legacy here at Niagara Falls at the end of the program. We will get there. Now, allow me to introduce Frederick Olmsted. Let's see. David, are you up there? There we go. Okay. We're having a hard time communicating between the clicker and the receiver up there. I'm going to have to hold it high. Allow me to introduce Frederick Olmsted. Here is a colorful description of the man by his friend George Templeton Strong, a well-known public figure and diarist of the day. This is George Templeton Strong. He is an extraordinary fellow, decidedly the most remarkable specimen of human nature with whom I have ever been into close relationship. Talent and energy the most rare. Absolute purity and disinterestedness. Prominent defects, monomania, persistent in organization. He works like a dog all day and sits up nearly all night, doesn't go home to his family for 5 days together, works with steady feverish intensity until 4 in the morning, sleeps on a sofa in his clothes and breakfasts on strong coffee and pickles. Well, I don't know about you, ladies and gentlemen, I have been known to breakfast on strong coffee as I did this morning, but breakfasting on strong pickles at 6 in the morning doesn't particularly appeal. Well, here's Frederick himself reminiscing on his boyhood. I was very active, imaginative, impulsive, inventive, enterprising, trustful and heedless, a mischievous and troublesome boy. I was nominally the pupil of a topographical engineer, but really, for the most part, given over to a decently restrained vagabond life, generally pursued under the guise of an angler, a fowler, or a dabbler on the shallow shores of the deep sea of the natural sciences. Well, that mischievous boy turned vagabond certainly eventually made something of his life. I hope you come away from today's program with a more enhanced feel for this man and what made him tick, and the legacy that he and his sons bequeathed to the nation. Central Park. Brooklyn's Prospect Park, there's the Long Meadow. Boston's Emerald Necklace, Boston's Emerald Necklace. The White City of the Chicago World's Fair. The park systems of Buffalo, of course there's Delaware Park in Buffalo. And Louisville, another park system in Louisville. There's Cherokee Park in Louisville. Parks in Chicago. Here's the Japanese garden inside Jackson Park in Chicago. Here is Bell Island, Detroit, where I just was 2 days ago. Here is the Olmsted Linear Park in the Drew Hills neighborhood of Atlanta. Here is the Biltmore Estate, you just heard about that. Here is the U.S. Capitol grounds. Here is Riverside, Illinois, one of the first intentionally designed green garden suburbs in the United States. And here is Mount Royal Park in Montreal, as they would pronounce it up there. Those are just a handful of the more celebrated, masterful landscapes designed by Frederick Olmsted Sr. But if you add in the park designs and landscapes carried out by his two sons of the Olmsted brothers firm, the imprint across the geography of North America is simply astounding. Well, we've got Niagara Falls instead. Okay, here we go. We'll return to Niagara Falls. Here it is, 700 public parks and these are just the public parks, and 6,000 commissions. 700 public parks and 6,000 commissions across the U.S. and Canada. I want to share a few items from media coverage in the past several years. We have a very well-read audience. Perhaps some of you read the New York Review of Books. An article appeared a few years ago titled America's Green Giant, and the author who wrote this article was Martin Filler, and he was featuring several new volumes by and about Olmsted, including this wonderful collection of his essays, by the way, which I commend to you. After initially calling attention to the High Line Linear Park along Manhattan's west side, Filler writes this, quote, "Yet however much the High Line has enriched the post-millennial megalopolis, its social effects pale in comparison to the revolutionary version of the public park as promulgated by its greatest American exponent, the 19th century polymath, Frederick Olmsted," unquote. I expect some of you read this following column by Michiko Kakutani in the COVID winter of 2021, a moving essay. Turns out Michiko, by the way, is an avid bird watcher. Some of you know this if you read the Times. And the heading of this particular piece was Finding Refuge in a Snowy Owl in Central Park. First, we have to start with a nice wintertime picture of Central Park. Here's the owl, that's a little premature. Here's Central Park in winter. This is an extract of a much longer piece of hers. Forgive us, the screen is a little problematic in terms of some of the captions and slide titles. Bear with us here. Now, I'm reading from Michiko's essay. Central Park, quote, "Central Park has long provided a refuge from the anxieties and stresses of daily life, perhaps never more so than during the time of the coronavirus. New Yorkers who visited the park every day, as well as those who have long taken it for granted, felt a renewed love for this amazing rectangle of green in the heart of the big city. Its startlingly lush woodlands and rolling lawns, its meandering trails and wide open meadows, and of course, its astonishing wildlife, including owls." Here is that very snowy owl, maybe. "Including owls, hawks, herons, and a dizzying array of other birds who for generations have used Central Park as a vital rest stop in their migratory travels. Knowing what many humans only came to fully appreciate during the uncertainties of the pandemic, that the park is a beautiful and essential sanctuary." Very nicely said, Michiko, thank you. By the way, if I had written that, I would have underlined and bolded the word essential. Just to give you a sense of the path that brought me to this project, when I was young, I would visit the house of my maternal grandparents, very near Boston's Franklin Park. A little older, as a young adult, I would visit the Back Bay Fens and the Fenway in Boston. And then further down what we now call the Riverway, I would jog around Jamaica Pond. And further down the Riverway, I would botanize here at the Harvard Arnold Arboretum. All of those are integrated into Boston's famed Emerald Necklace, a crescent of Olmsted-designed parks and parkways that wind around a major portion of the city of Boston. Of course, I would also visit Central Park, and eventually come upon Prospect Park. And the first time I entered through this arch, Endale Arch, to come upon the expanse of the lawn meadow in Prospect Park, tears welled up in my eyes as I was simply overwhelmed by its sheer beauty and utter perfection. This was decades before the notion of making a film about Frederick Olmsted had occurred to me. I expect some of you in the audience saw the WNED film. I think it's had a fair amount of airplay here. Frederick Olmsted, Designing America. Our executive producers were based here at WNED, Buffalo, Toronto. Perhaps you caught the original PBS broadcast. Perhaps you've seen other public screenings of it here or in Buffalo. Perhaps you've seen it on PBS.org or Amazon Prime. It's available in all those places, by the way. I'll give you a URL at the end. I learned very shortly after moving to Portland, Oregon some 28 years ago that the entire park system there was master planned by another Olmsted, the stepson, John Charles or John C. Olmsted. About 15 years ago, after completion of a prior film, I'm wondering what would be next, I approached an old friend. His name was Lawrence Hott. Larry Hott is pretty well known at WNED. He also produced a film about Niagara Falls about 20 years ago, by the way. And I said, Larry, you know what? It's about time the two of us collaborated again. What do you say about producing a film, a full-length biography of Frederick Olmsted? Well, it did take about 7 years from start to finish, but we did produce it thanks to WNED giving us some assistance. And it did premiere, in fact, here in Buffalo at WNED, as well as in Boston, New York City, Washington, D.C. You could say that is what has brought me here today. By the way, Larry Hott is an associate of Ken Burns. He's one of the co-founders of Karen's company, Florentine Films. But he split off. Subsequently, he has his own independent production company. In case you're wondering, Florentine Films, it's not Florence, Italy. It's Florence, Massachusetts, where all of us, me included, we all spend hours at Miss Flo's Diner, decompressing after spending an entire day in the field shooting film and still photography with the same instructors in Hampshire College. We all attended Hampshire College together. We were the same class. Ken and I started out together. Anyway, I've continued during these past many years since the film premiered to dig into the archives, to interview scholars, to spend time with the practitioners across America, and to revisit some of my favorite sites like Niagara Falls and the park system of Buffalo, but always continuing to visit new parks as I am doing this trip, as I always do when I travel across America. So allow me to summarize some of the salient content of the film and to expand upon it a little and to share some of my leanings with you. Rather than reviewing Olmsted's entire career in this program, what I want to simply do is launch him on his career trajectory and to hint at some of the stops along the curvilinear path, if you will, that caused him to become America's great park maker. His early years in brief. He started life in Connecticut, the son of a successful merchant, John Olmsted of Hartford, Connecticut. He roamed his native Connecticut countryside, initially in his father's saddle on horseback, in silent, contemplative, reverie-filled trips of the western portions of Connecticut, the Connecticut River Valley, and the Berkshire foothills. Young Frederick attended several boarding schools in Connecticut, but he had to abandon plans for college due to weak eyesight. His younger brother, his beloved younger brother, John Olmsted, did enter Yale, not Fred, but he, in essence, audited his brother's classes. One of his favorites was scientific agriculture. He did hang out with all these Yaleys. Whoops, well, I'm skipping ahead. He did hang out with all these Yaleys. Let's talk about, I'm sorry, I'm skipping ahead. I'm going to talk about that Yale trip in a minute. He worked briefly for a New York City dry goods importing firm, but the young man was captured by the romance of life at sea. And in 1843, he set out for China as an apprentice seaman. Thus, Fred Olmsted had his year before the master, if you will, as a seaman, sailing to China and back. And it was a harrowing experience, as you read about it in the biography. He did attend lectures at Yale, including the one on scientific agriculture, but he hung out during this time period with these other Yaleys, including here's his beloved younger brother, John. Oh, here's Frederick in front. This is Charles Loring Grace, the founder of the Children's Aid Society in New York, one of the leading social reformers of the day. The Children's Aid Society in New York had huge influence, by the way. Charles Loring Grace remained a lifelong friend and intellectual advisor and career advisor to Frederick Law. He had a profound influence on his entire career trajectory. Now, in 1846, Olmsted began to explore a career, in fact, as a scientific farmer, a field that was on the rise. First, he apprenticed at a log farm near Syracuse, New York, briefly. And then, with his father's financial assistance, he farms at a very poor property on the Connecticut shore. He's not there long. It doesn't prove good for farming. Subsequently, he buys a larger property on Staten Island, Tulsamore Farm. Come on, Tulsamore Farm. There you are. There's Olmsted's own sketch of Tulsamore Farm below, a mid-20th century black and white photograph of the site above. There, he actually makes considerable improvements to the land. Lots of planting, lots of earth moving. He is experimenting in new drainage techniques that he learned actually during his walking tour of England that you'll hear about shortly. And you might be wondering, oh, is that property there today? Yes, it is. This is what it looks like. Not in good shape. It's the Olmsted Wheelhouse in Staten Island. They a nonprofit organization is busy raising funds to restore the interior, the exterior, to an authentic condition as possible, and the grounds, the gardens, so that it will be open for historic home tours at a date uncertain in the future. Looking forward to that. Now, 1850, Frederick travels to Europe and the British Isles with his brother and his dear friend, Charles Loring Grace. More about that in a second. Also in 1850, Olmsted is hired by the New York Times to tour the South, file reports from the field. More about that in a few minutes. In 1855, Olmsted becomes partner in the firm that publishes the popular Putnam's Monthly magazine. But that business fails. That business fails in 1857. In that same year, Olmsted's first book about the South, A Journey in the Seaboard Slave States, is published. Sorry, folks. There we are. That is his first book that comes out of his journeys through the South. 1857 is a momentous year in Olmsted's life. He's appointed first superintendent of Central Park, and it is after that that he and English-born architect Calvert Vaux collaborate on the winning design, great sport, of course, for Central Park. You all know about this. And with that success, Olmsted is appointed architect-in-chief for Central Park. Here he is, with his cape and his hat, looking so debonair and distinguished. That's the way we always remember him, as architect-in-chief is for Central Park. In 1859, he marries Mary Cleveland Perkins Olmsted, his brother's widow, who dies young, tragically, of tuberculosis in Europe. He leaves a moving deathbed letter, which features prominently in our film, asking his older brother to look after Mary and the kids when he's gone. And he does. Olmsted marries the widow and formally adopts the children, raising them as his own. In 1861, Olmsted is appointed General Secretary of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, a Civil War-era national relief effort securing aid and supplies for wounded soldiers. More on that in a few minutes as well. After resigning his appointment with the Sanitary Commission, Olmsted is appointed Commissioner of the Yosemite and Mariposa mining estates. He moves all the way to the Sierra Nevada, and he's running a gold mine. Go figure. Here is with his wife in the Mariposa Grove. There we are picnicking on horseback in the Mariposa Grove. Here is Mariposa, California, circa 1860. It's a roughneck mining town. But while he is there, he's appointed to a California state body and plays a leadership role in writing the first report proposing the protection of Yosemite Valley before anyone else. More about that report in a little bit. In 1865, Olmsted was reappointed landscape architect for Central Park, and with Calvert Vaux, he begins work on Prospect Park in Brooklyn. Brooklyn, which was a separate city, by the way, the second largest city in the United States at that point in time, an entirely separate city. Brooklyn said, hey, Manhattan has a Central Park, we want one of those too, we gotta compete. So they started planning with Olmsted and Vaux Prospect Park. And on Broadway in Manhattan, Olmsted and Vaux opened the first office of practicing landscape architecture in the United States, thus launching a unique career. Now, over the course of his life, Olmsted, we're going to call him Olmsted Sr. here, he experienced considerable family tragedy, early deaths of mother, brother, and 2 children. His own near death in a terrible accident in Central Park that left him maimed for life. And he was plagued with a nearly lifelong struggle with dark depression. Facing these and all sorts of other infirmities and ailments towards the end of his career, he was still designing the landscape for the 1893 World Columbian Exposition. Let's see if we can bring it up. There it is. And the Biltmore Estate, the grounds of the Biltmore Estate, and supervising the creation of these, his final masterpieces. Then, after a few years of waning physical and mental health, he tragically lost his mind. Olmsted passed away in 1903 at the McLean Asylum on the outskirts of Boston, the institution, the very grounds of which he had designed. What a story, what a life. Now let's review certain aspects of Olmsted's career. Perhaps we should say careers, plural. His manifold roles of scientific farmer, social reformer, capable administrator, writer, editor, and literary publisher, landscape designer, and master park builder. Olmsted Sr. was first and foremost a social reformer. He identified himself as such, first and foremost, before he identified himself as a landscape architect. His career was central to the social reform movement of the U.S. during the second half of the 19th century. He was a philosopher of democracy. He read widely and deeply and wrote thoughtfully about this subject, and manifested it in his philosophy of park design and in his actual park creations. Olmsted had a lot to say about Central Park during the decades he was working on it. Here are the two fragments. I'm going to give you a picture of the sheep meadow, which, by the way, was closed until spring 2021. It had a COVID closure of the entire sheep meadow. Here it is reopening spring 2021. This is Olmsted, speaking about Central Park. It is one great purpose of the park to supply to hundreds of thousands of tired workers who have no opportunity to spend their summers in the country inexpensively, what a month or two in the White Mountains or the Adirondacks is at great cost to those in easier circumstances. In Central Park, you will find all classes largely represented with a common purpose, each individual adding by his mere presence to the pleasure of all others, all helping to the greater happiness of each. You often see vast numbers of persons brought closely together, poor and rich, young and old. As one of our commentators, historian Keith Morgan, said, Olmsted intensely believed in democracy and the park as a site for the enactment of democracy. In fact, one could say that recent scholarship underlines this very fact, that Central Park was Olmsted's response to what he witnessed in the South prior to the Civil War and during the Civil War, and that this great park to be built in New York City would provide a counterpoint, a welcoming democratic space where anyone could gather, regardless of origin or background, and that the park itself would point the way for the future of the nation healing after the Civil War. Though he strayed away from describing himself as such, he was indeed an artist. As is stated by historian Sarah Cedar Miller in our film, Central Park was arguably the most important piece of American art of the 19th century. Clearly, it was the most monumental in scale. Author and Olmsted expert Elizabeth Barlow Rogers, the founder of the Central Park Conservancy and an Olmsted scholar in her own right, this is what she had to say about Central Park in our film. Quote, "It is a triumph of 19th century engineering, a symphonic sequence of beautiful spaces." How perfect. A symphonic sequence of beautiful spaces. Now, this is how I like to capture it. I'm going to give you this famous Thomas Cole picture, painted by canvas, of course, considered the founder of the Hudson River School, often known as the Oxbow. The actual title, unless mistaken, is after Thunderstone. This is an Oxbow in the Connecticut River. This is Mount Holyoke. There's actually an artist with an easel here, and he's got this kind of flag posted here on the wrong property. And by the way, this isn't just a generic picture of the Hudson River School. To me, I lived here. I went to college here. I lived in a farmhouse a couple miles north of the Oxbow. I've been on the summit of Mount Holyoke here countless times. This is a personal picture to me. What the Hudson River School painters were doing with pigment and brush on 2 dimensions in canvas, Olmsted and Marx, together collaborating, were drawing, painting, etching, sculpting the landscapes of America's great cities, not in 2, not in 3, but in 4 dimensions. Anyone? What's the 4th dimension they were working in? Time. Time. Ding, 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 ding. Thank you. I knew a few of you would get it. In Olmsted's own words, "I have all my life been considering distant effects, and always sacrificing immediate success and applause to that of the future. In laying out Central Park, we determined to think of no results to be realized in less than 40 years. By the way, you don't have to read too much of Olmsted's writings or visit too many of his parks, including in Buffalo, including perhaps here at Niagara Falls, to realize he didn't just think 40 years ahead. His vision was 100, 200 years into the future. Now, I don't have time to do a deep dive into landscape design theory or landscape history here today. This isn't a class as such in that topic, but let me simply say that as a landscape designer, Olmsted clearly was influenced by those who came before him, practitioners of garden design and deep thinkers in the realm of art, such as John Ruskin. But I also would mention the great English landscape designers, Capability Brown and Humphrey Repton, who were his antecedents, if you will. And what about here in the Hudson River Valley? We have to give a nod to Andrew Jackson Downing, who was so influential at this point in 19th century America. By the way, in fact, Downing had met a premature death on board a terrible steamboat accident in the Hudson River. He would have been the likely choice as the designated designer of Central Park. His terrible, tragic death opened up an opportunity for Olmsted to enter the picture. I also want to offer the shorthand. As you're reading literature at this time period, you're reading about the Hudson River School, including Thomas Cole's own writings, you're reading aesthetic theory from the English Romantic poets, and again the English landscape designers, and you're reading Olmsted, you always hear references to the sublime, to the pastoral and the picturesque. Now, it's hard to create the sublime in the middle of a big city. After all, what is the sublime? Well, in Europe, it was the Matterhorn, it was the Alps, the crags of the English Lake District. Here in America, it was Niagara Falls, the Adirondacks, the Catskills, the White Mountains. You can't recreate those in the heart of the city, but you can certainly recreate the pastoral and the picturesque. So I'm going to give you a shorthand right in Central Park, because these exist in all of the Olmsted masterworks. You go from the sheep meadow, bright, sunlit, open meadow, trees around the fringe, great place for people to gather in numbers if they so choose. And here, this is the north end of the sheep meadow, by the way, and only a half mile from here, not even. You takes you to Ramble. Let's see if we can get this tour. Takes you to the Ramble, the famous birding hotspot of Central Park. You know, narrow, winding lanes, great amount of tree cover, burblings, water features nearby, and a great place for solitude in nature. And what a contrast. And you find these contrasts usually several times over in places like Central Park or Prospect Park, the pastoral to the picturesque and vice versa. And that's one of the secrets of all the Olmsted masterworks. Is those are the sons, and by the way, many landscape artists have followed all the way to about the 1/3 of the way through the 20th century. Now, as builder of Central Park, Olmsted successfully managed thousands and led one of the largest construction projects to that point in time in America. During the Civil War, as director of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, the forerunner to the Red Cross, Olmsted perfected his management skills while heading up a huge supply medical relief and field hospital operation that included managing a veritable flotilla of hospital ships. Here is a USSC hospital ship depicted on the Mississippi. And during this period, Olmsted reorganized the entire Army Medical Corps, coordinated contributions of volunteers from local aid societies. In fact, by the way, given what we've just lived through, the Sanitary Commission was the largest national public health initiative up to that time in American history. Olmsted was in charge of it. Sanitary fairs were held in all the major cities of the North. I don't know if there was one in Buffalo, but there were from Chicago to Philadelphia and points in between. And this is the one that's in Philadelphia. Catherine Prescott Orley was one of the women leaders of the day. They were busy running these fairs, raising funds to support the Sanitary Commission. And by the way, she was a nurse working in the field alongside Olmsted and wrote descriptively about his driven nature. And they were there together at the aftermath of two of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War, Antietam, and maybe we'll see Gettysburg. There's the USSC at Gettysburg. Now, as to his early writings, Olmsted published his first publication, actually. His first publication was a travelogue and a reflective series of essays in this volume, Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England. The original on the left, you too can buy that very edition on the right. And it was at that point, particularly while exploring the English countryside, that Olmsted was working out what overarching landscape design concepts he thought best to apply to American soil, and by doing so to enhance the public park experience for everyone, not just the wealthy elite, as the parks were up until that point in time in England and the U.S. In fact, Olmsted was particularly inspired by England's very first publicly financed park, Birkenhead Park. I have two images for you. The Birkenhead Park, designed by Joseph Paxton, just across the waterway. Oops, sorry. I don't know if I can read it back. Just across the waterway, well, Birkenhead Park, just across the waterway from Liverpool. And by the way, Olmsted admitted that he liberally borrowed some, there we are, he liberally borrowed some of the design elements from this park because he thought they were so perfect, and he put them right into the greensward design for Central Park, and he admitted as such. On another front, the literary republic. The literary republic, and by the way, that says writer, editor, and publisher. His 3 volumes about the journeys of the South and the plains through the slave states, through the frontier, Texas, and through Kansas, had a lasting impact, and they are still in print. The later version of this, consolidated, re-edited with a different tone by Olmsted himself, came out as The Cotton Kingdom. You too can buy a version of this today with an introduction by Arthur Schlesinger Jr. The Cotton Kingdom also had a map that Olmsted produced along with it. There it is. Olmsted, by the way, at this point, his journalistic career, he was a journalist. His journalistic career started when he was hired by the early iteration of the New York Times, meaning the New York Daily Times, there it is, as a Roman correspondent in what seemed to be a foreign land, the antebellum South. When the first book was published in England, it had a huge impact on intelligentsia, At the outset of the Civil War, British public opinion was leaning towards supporting the Confederacy. Olmsted's writings about the South, his graphic descriptions of the institution of slavery, his analysis of the economics of slave labor in the South versus free labor in the North, had a worldwide impact, and they still are out there resonating in the world, if you will, with new scholarship on this very topic. And it swayed British public opinion away from supporting the Confederacy towards the Union side at the outset of the Civil War. And it's cited by none other than Charles Darwin as influential when he was struggling with the concept of race as he was preparing The Origin of Species for publication. And I don't know if I have a slide for you here, I might have hit it, but let's see, I do. And it had an influence on the young Malcolm X, hungrily reading and feeding his mind as he was maturing in his political thought and coming to terms with the history and the institution of slavery in America. By the way, Olmsted's writings about slavery, even though they use language that you would not, everyone would point to as being politically incorrect today, his writings about slavery are sometimes pointed to as the most accurate depiction of slavery outside of slave narratives from that particular time. In addition to his stint as publisher and co-editor of Putnam's Monthly, Olmsted co-founded The Nation magazine. He co-founded it and edited The Nation magazine, the longest-running publication of liberal opinion in America to this day. During this relatively brief period in his career, he befriended and published some of the most prominent writers and intellectuals of the day, basically all the founding members of what we now point to as the American literary Renaissance. And he was profoundly influenced by transcendentalism, by the way. Now I'm just going to show you some. This is but a few. We're going to do clockwise. There's Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, that's Herbert Melville, and Harriet Beecher Stowe. You could add many others to this list. They were part of his circle. He was part of theirs. He edited and published all of these individuals. You could add Longfellow to that list, Washington Irving and others. And during this time, he had contact with several key members of the second generation of Hudson River School, including notably for this audience, Frederick Edward Church. There's that famous campus of Niagara Falls. Obviously, this is not Church, but this is his famous campus of Niagara Falls. Well, you get the point. Between the Putnam's Monthly and The Nation, and through his social circle, his ties to the cultural leadership, his contacts were a veritable who's who of the arts and letters of America during this time. To that list can be added most of the leading social reformers of the day of New England and New York. One note, we tried to give some due credit to Calvin Fox in our film. There he is, there they are, working side by side. Olmsted's partner, the man who brought Olmsted into the actual design of Central Park and who subsequently convinced Olmsted to return to the business of park building once Prospect Park was in the offing. And of course, they collaborated right here in Niagara Falls as well. Poor Fox, the sometimes neglected lesser-known partner, at least to the general public, but a great architect in his own right, yet a man that time seems to have passed over. Not as well known at this point. It's important to understand the origins of the public park movement in North America at this time. In the highly polluted cities of the 19th century, trees, shrubs, and lawns served famously as the lungs of the city, creating refuges of fresh air. Park advocates argued that parks provided refined imitations of nature, claiming that exposure to them would improve people's character, regardless of their socioeconomic status. Architect and landscape designer Andrew Jackson Downing actually wrote this in 1848, and I think it stands the test of time. Quote, parks will be better preachers of temperance than temperance societies, better refiners of national manners than dancing schools, and better promoters of general good feeling than any lectures on the philosophy of happiness. Unquote. I think it stands the test of time. What about you? Well, sentiments like that reflect the influence of the Romantics on the New World's attitudes towards nature. What had once been seen something separate from humans to be conquered in fear became something humans were part of that they could turn to for restoration. Downing and Olmsted brought their experiences of touring European gardens to the U.S., further emphasizing the beneficial relationship between humans and nature and democratizing the public park experience. By the way, before Central Park, urban New Yorkers had no place to recreate. The average person, the working class person. Yes, there was one place. People went there for sure. Could walk the bucolic lanes of the Greenwood Cemetery. You can still do that today. It's gorgeous. It's beautiful. Maybe some of you have been there. That was the principal place for urban New Yorkers, but not the commoners. No, it was the well-heeled, the society, high society, who would show up there on a Sunday afternoon in their Sunday finest after church for carriage rides and to perambulate in the shady lanes of Greenwood Cemetery. It wasn't the commoners. Olmsted was adamant that Central Park served everyone, regardless of their skin color, family origin, or economic status. I should emphasize here that, by the way, the parks were absolutely seen as instruments for public health. Isn't that interesting? In the mid-19th century, New York and all cities were still dealing with terrible outbreaks of cholera and other diseases. By the way, Frederick and Mary Olmsted lost their first child during one such outbreak of cholera in New York. In their argument supporting the design for Central Park, Olmsted and his collaborator Fox wrote this in 1868. We'll put up another picture of the sheep meadow here. Sorry, of Greensward. This is Olmsted and Fox in their argument for Central Park. Quote, it's a little bit longer, bear with me. Quote, there is no doubt that the more intense intellectual activity which prevails equally in the library, the workshop, and the counting room makes tranquilizing recreation more essential to continued health and strength. Civilized men are growing more and more subject to insidious enemies to their health and happiness, and against these, the remedy cannot be found in medicine or in athletic recreations, but only in such forms of gentle exercise as are calculated to equalize the circulation and relieve the brain. Unquote. Now that's somewhat archaic language, perhaps. You may not entirely agree with their case for passive versus active recreation. Times have changed. Even the Olmsted brothers incorporated many athletic fields in their commissions, by the way. But you can see, in essence, Olmsted and Fox here were early, along with Henry David Thoreau, early proponents of what we now call forest bathing, very popular, coming over from Japan. But they were proponents of that back in the 19th century. Now, folks, I have to wonder, a little bit of a comic aside, I have to wonder what Olmsted would think if you were with us today, perhaps at Niagara Falls, or perhaps at Buffalo Park, or perhaps even worse at one of our prestigious national parks, to see people wandering around with wires dangling from their ears, or maybe funny little protuberance sticking out, completely oblivious of the soundtrack of the natural world, or perhaps even worse, like this, this trio on a park bench, entranced by their shimmering screens and completely oblivious of the sounds and input of the natural world of the park that they're sitting in. I'll point the finger at myself, I've done this too, but I wonder what Olmsted would think about this habit, folks. I wonder what he would think. Now, our film zooms in on the story with no doubt they're paying attention to their very important social media feed. Maybe they're solving the problems of the world, but I doubt it. Anyway, our film zooms in on the stories of Central Park, Prospect Park, Buffalo, and the Emerald Necklace. So a few comments about those projects before I move on to other sites and other members of the family. By the way, Olmsted and Fox considered Prospect Park their masterpiece. Why? Well, I'm sorry. There we are. They considered it their masterpiece because they weren't hemmed in by a rectangular area, a rigid rectangular area, as they were at Central Park. They didn't encounter nearly the same level of political and physical interference. Plus, they didn't need to make as many compromises with their original artistic design, so they considered it their masterpiece. But by the way, I think I have a picture. Let's see. When I first entered Endale Arch, I think I hid the picture. When I first entered Endale Arch, it was in a deteriorated state. If you go to the Grand Army Plaza entrance in Brooklyn, to enter through the Endale Arch today into the Longmeadow Central Prospect Park, ooh, you should see what the Central Park the Prospect Park Alliance and the Parks Department have done there. What a jewel it is now. Tiger wood paneling, recessed lighting, all the ceiling, all the stucco, all the concrete repaired, and the wood paneling reinstalled, and it's a totally different experience now. Check out Prospect Park, enter through Endale Arch. Now, what about Boston, my original hometown? Here's the 1887 Olmsted plan on the left. There's an Emerald Necklace Conservancy map on the right. Here's another Olmsted Emerald Necklace map. This, by the way, this was the beginning of the Emerald Necklace. It's the Muddy River, the Thames. And this was the transformation of a tidal basin flowing into the Charles River Basin that was part of the public sewers for the city of Boston at this point in the 19th century. By the way, it could be pointed to as the first true wetland restoration project in the history of the United States, what Olmsted did there in the Fens in 1887. Now, I could talk about many of the delightful discoveries in the making of the film. In fact, one was Buffalo. I haven't been, before beginning research on the film, I have not been to Buffalo since I was 6 years old. I had a dim memory of Buffalo. I certainly did remember Niagara Falls. Olmsted left a vivid impression. But you know, the Olmsted Park system in Buffalo, I expect all of you know this, I'm speaking to the converted, it's arguably the best maintained, full-size Olmsted Park system in the nation. In fact, here are two of those famous parks. You can bring them up. There's Delaware Park on the left and the front park on the right. And by the way, look at that. What are all those connections? Those are the parkways, invented, literally invented for the world in Buffalo by Olmsted and Blocks. Parkways did not exist before this time. This was the first integrated park system to ever be designed and built in America. The whole idea behind this was to think of Buffalo as a city contained within a giant park. And the parkways are not narrow little green strips. You've all seen the existing parkways still in Buffalo with wide, multi-lane pathways in some instances and landscape traffic circles. The whole idea here was that anyone, no matter where you live in Buffalo, could be within easy access to a park-like environment, no matter where you live. And that's what all cities are still trying to do to this day. Go figure. Olmsted and Blocks planned it in the 19th century for Buffalo. Let's see if I can give you a picture of a parkway. Maybe. There we are. There's a historic Lincoln Parkway on the left with equestrian traffic on it. There's Watergate Bidwell on the right. I was just driving on road parkways this morning before coming to Niagara Falls. It's, you know, it was really novel what Olmsted and Blocks were doing in Buffalo. I mean, it was actually arguably revolutionary, not just for America, but for the world at this point in time, I'll have you know. And I expect also some of you know this. I also came upon it this morning, even though I wasn't intending to, but I did. Here is of course, the Richardson Olmsted complex, as it's now referred to in Buffalo. This building complex, with its landscape design by Olmsted, building architecture by H.H. Richardson, started out life, as all of you know, as the Buffalo Insane Asylum. And it's one of many collaborations between Olmsted and Blocks in New York State and in New England, by the way. And I don't know, I went by there today, I know that they're maintaining the landscape. It seems to me that the Henry Hotel is maybe closed. Does anyone know? That's too bad. That's unfortunate. COVID, I guess, huh? That's too bad. Because it was operating as a conference center, hotel, restaurant, meeting space. I was there pre-COVID. I saw it all. Too bad it didn't really survive this whole period of time. Hopefully, it will be fully revived in the future. Tough times for some institutions. Let's talk about John C. Olmsted, the elder brother, also called John Charles, John C. Olmsted. Let's bring him up, maybe. What happened? Oh, well, okay, that's not, okay. We're going to, a quick picture of Niagara Falls, because I'm going to return to it at the end of the program, so that picture kind of snuck in there. Hold on. I'll return to Niagara Falls. Okay, I'll return to this. Those are all supposed to be hidden, because I'll return to it at the end of the program. Let's talk about John Charles Olmsted, also known as John C., sequentially nephew, stepson, and business partner. The young man learned his father's acute skills of breeding the land, understanding soils and vegetation types, and he acquired his father's artistic skills as a draftsman and a landscape designer. He joined the father's firm in 1875 after graduating from Yale. And before his father's retirement, he worked with his father on many projects, including the aforementioned Back Bay Fence, the Biltmore Estate. Then, as senior partner with the Olmsted Brothers firm, he led the Essex County Park System project in Newark, New Jersey. Well, part of it's in Newark. It's a county-wide park system. Here is Redwood Park, famous for its flowering cherries every spring, right in the heart of Newark. By the way, the first county-wide park system in the nation, still considered to this day one of the best, master planned by this son, John C. Olmsted. He also worked in Atlanta, Louisville, and Chicago on other park projects. He left a huge mark in the Pacific Northwest across urban and rural landscapes from Idaho to Victoria, BC. He was invited out by the cost share, the three cities of Portland, Spokane, and Seattle cost share. They brought him out there, where I live in the Pacific Northwest. He was enchanted by scenes like this. That's the steep banks of Puget Sound, the hillsides, I should say, slopes with Douglas fir, Puget Sound, islands, and mountains in the background. He was also enchanted by scenes like this. Maybe we can bring it up. Seattle, there, with Mount Rainier looming in the background, and so he was enchanted by these scenes, and he wanted to capture them in some of his parks that he would eventually design. By the way, he kept spending more and more time, John C. Olmsted, going between Boston and Portland, Oregon. And it's interesting how his entire personality changed. He left Boston as the very proper Bostonian. You know those proper Bostonians, looking maybe like this. And he spent more and more time in the Pacific Northwest, Portland, Seattle, Spokane, and he took on an entire new appearance. He copped a Sherlock Holmes look. The only thing missing is the pipe. Go figure. You know, the funny thing is, the same thing happened to me about 28 years ago. These things happen when you move from one coast to the other. Anyway, so he worked on 35 different projects in Seattle. Well, let's actually first talk about this. The Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition. 1905, it put Portland on the national map, just as the father worked on the WCE, the World Columbian Exposition in Chicago. The sons worked on expositions across America too. Not here on the famous exposition in Buffalo, at least not that I'm aware of. But here's the 1905 Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition. And he also worked on what the satellites called the AYP exposition. If we can bring it up, there it is. Notice the sight lines. 1909, the AYP exposition. Notice this. This is the Court of Honor. And there's that big Mount Rainier looming, greatly exaggerated in this artist's work. But this becomes the centerpiece for the UW campus, meaning the University of Washington. There's the Court of Honor, here's the Drumheller Fountain, and here in the distance, much more accurate than this photograph, is Mount Rainier. So the centerpiece of the modern-day UW campus started as the AYP exposition grounds in Seattle. Not uncommon that these things would happen. By the way, in Seattle, he worked on 35 parks, all with connected parkways. Does that remind you of a map I just showed you a little while ago? Seattle, of course it did. Like father, like son. He was mirroring his dad with an extensive integrated park system in Seattle. Here's Volunteer Park. Here is Green Lake Park. Here is the Washington Park Arbory. And I'm going to not take time with Spokane just now. I'm going to show you just two sites in my hometown of Portland, Oregon. Right where I live is considered the most perfect homestead park. Portland Laurelhurst Park. It's just beautiful. And this city has a large forest on hills overlooking downtown. We now know it as Forest Park. Here it is positioned with the city. Here it is. So this is the Willamette Valley Industrial Corridor, our famous St. John's Suspension Bridge. Here's downtown Portland. You can barely make it out of the background. This is Forest Park. Crisscrossed with trails. By the way, it is at 5,200 acres, the second largest urban forest preserve in the United States. We have black bear, cougar, and elk within miles of downtown Portland because of this wildlife corridor connected to our coast range. Partly thanks to John C. Olmsted saying to the city fathers, do not develop it, protect it. And now it is one of the most perfect recreational resources for a metropolitan area of 2.5 million people. So partly thanks to John C. Olmsted. There's one bridge, a beautiful crafted bridge on one of his many recreational trails. Now, before I talk about the other son, Junior, we have to talk about the World Columbian Exposition. I'm going to try to get through this a little bit fast. The World Columbian Exposition basically was the start of the City Beautiful movement in America. Of course, the elder worked on the work of the WCE, as you all know. But what I did, Lake Park in Milwaukee is often pointed to as a City Beautiful Park, as well, by the way, City Beautiful Era Park. But here it is, the building of City Beautiful. And it was, of course, Daniel Burnham. Maybe we'll bring him up. Here he is, famous Daniel Burnham, architect and urban planner, the entrepreneur, visionary behind the World Columbian Exposition. You all read Devil in the White City. Take the big ego guy. You can see how big he is. Look at that head. And he's famous for this expression, make no little plans. And he assembled all of the architects of the day, along with Frederick Olmsted, to design the White City. It birthed the City Beautiful movement in America. It already basically existed in Paris. But here is the White City that would be landscaped by Frederick Law. And this sets something up. Now, I should say about the White City, as with any World's Fair, including the one here in Buffalo, no doubt, you know, it was a fantasy, it was a folly, temporary stage set. It was a utopian fantasy. It wasn't designed to last. It pointed the way for, you know, the technological future, and so on and so forth. And it was where mostly the well-heeled spent time. Well, the commoners too certainly made their way to some of these World's Fairs if they could afford it. But it certainly contrasted greatly with the disorderly neighborhoods of our cities back then. The contrast was almost too much to behold. Such an orderly, clean, beautiful white space, especially Chicago back then. But the whole idea behind it was that you could take architecture and landscape architecture and urban planning and create something new to point to the future of the nation. And it did set something in motion called the Macmillan Plan for Washington, D.C. And Junior, by the way, was deeply involved with this, Frederick Olmsted Jr., the younger of the two sons, the son of Frederick Law and Mary Cleveland Perkins Olmsted, the widow, often referred to as Rick or Junior, as we'll call him. He was brought into the family practice, and he left a huge mark across America, from Southern California to Maine and Florida and our nation's capital, very much so. Here is young Rick Olmsted. By the way, he did attend Harvard, and he was aware of his father's fervent desire to have him carry on both the family name and the profession. The father insisted that the son become far better educated in botany and horticulture than the father felt himself to be. So in the waiting years of his life, by the way, the father included this young son in the culminating projects of his own career, including, by the way, he spent a summer working in Daniel Burnham's office in Chicago while the World's Columbian Exposition arose. And he spent an entire year on site at Biltmore in 1894 while the 100,000-acre estate was being developed as a private central park, no less, for George Vanderbilt. Of course, here are the gardens. And by the way, keep in mind that Olmsted, senior and junior, worked on the entire landscape. If you've been to Biltmore, it's not just the gardens. It's the entire landscape, down to the minutest detail of every single plant and tree in the entire landscape planned out by the Olmsted family. Not just the gardens that just are adjacent to the house. It's the entire masterpiece landscape, the most extraordinary, sprawling private landscape ever crafted in America. He also, he became a full, with his father's death, Junior became a full partner with his half-brother in the family business. And both sons, Junior, and here is the family business. That's the Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site in South Brookline. It's a suburb of Boston. It's a national park site. You will be greeted by national park rangers. There's films, there's guided tours, there's the drafting rooms, there's the archives, there's the beautiful restored garden, all of it just a stone's throw from a portion of the Emerald Necklace. If you're on an Olmsted tour of Boston exploring the Emerald Necklace, you have to visit the Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site, folks. And Junior and his brother, elder brother, helped co-found the ASLA, the American Society for Landscape Architecture. And Junior helped found and taught at the first professional program in landscape architecture in the United States. We now call it the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where he taught and influenced generations of landscape architects and urban planners. He emerged on the national scene in 1901 when he was appointed to the Commission of Fine Arts in the District of Columbia, known as the Macmillan Commission, charged with interpreting for the 20th century Pierre Charles L'Enfant's visions of the nation's capital. He worked with his father's colleagues from the Chicago World's Fair to transform Washington into a work of civic art. But partial list of Junior's projects in the nation's capital reads like a guide to Washington, D.C., including the National Mall, including the Jefferson Memorial, including, well, you skip by there, it is, the Jefferson Memorial, including the National Zoo, also the White House grounds, here indicated as the executive mansions. And if you are working in the hothouse political atmosphere of D.C., you need to escape to Rock Creek Park, master planned by Junior, not just the park, the entire parkway. Now, speaking of the nation's capital, I do want to remind you that Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. also left his mark there. He did extensive landscaping work on the U.S. Capitol grounds and saw to the installation. He reoriented the entrance to the Capitol to the south side, and he saw to the west side of it, and he saw to he designed and oversaw the installation of the Capitol steps. You could call them Olmsted's steps, folks. I'm going to repeat that just once. The Capitol steps. Now, regarding the events, a minor little comment on my part, regarding the events of January 6, 2021, remember Olmsted saw all of his public commissions as sites where Americans would enact democracy. I wonder what Olmsted's particular take would be on the events of January 6, 2021, whether they would meet his expectations for American democracy. In August 2015, the National Park Service hosted a special event commemorating the 150th anniversary of Olmsted's historic report, The Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove of Big Trees. That report is credited with providing the basis for the creation of Yosemite National Park by the National Park Service Service to this day, and its thoughtful wording is considered the first step in the establishment of our National Park Service. In fact, its wording is considered the preamble to the creation of our National Park Service. By the way, you might remember that the National Park Service celebrated its 100th anniversary in 2016. In fact, it was Frederick Olmsted Jr. who played a key role in writing the language for the Organic Act of 1916, the founding legislation of our National Park Service. Like father, like son. In fact, Jr. and the Olmsted brothers worked on countless national parks across America. What about the visitor centers, their landscaping? What about the approach roads and the exit roads? What about the circulation routes? What about the interpretive trails around all the visitor centers? The Olmsted brothers for most of the 20th century, by the way, including, importantly, Acadia National Park, Everglades National Park, Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and Yosemite National Park. For 30 years, Junior was involved with the national parks. Let's swing back to the East Coast. We're going to talk about some of the residential commissions before we move on to other topics. The Senior, again, was involved with, where are we here? Senior was involved with Riverside, Illinois, established in 1869, also as being one of the first planned communities and garden suburbs in the U.S. 3 of Junior's residential masterpieces on the east are from north to south: Forest Hills Gardens in Queens, Roland Park in Baltimore, and the Mountain Lake Estates Historic District in Lake Wales and the Central Highlands of Florida. What is this? That's the Carillon. Where is that Carillon? There it is. It's in Park Tower Gardens in Lake Wales, Florida. It is the jewel in the crown of Frederick Law Olmsted Jr.'s botanical garden design career. It is stunning. If you're ever in the Central Highlands, yes, there are islands in Central Florida, and our south of Orlando, make a beeline to Lake Wales and visit this stunningly beautiful botanical garden environment, all designed by Junior. Now, I've talked a little bit about my corner of the country, the Pacific Northwest. What about the American West? The Olmsteds are all over the American West, including Junior, the entire Denver Mountain Park System, an extensive regional mountain park system that surrounds the entire area of urban Denver. In particular, Red Rocks Park. Some of them, I'm not going to talk in any great detail about this park, but I bet some of you have heard of the Red Rocks Amphitheater. Where is it? It's in Red Rocks Park, which is part of Olmsted Jr.'s master plan Denver Mountain Park System. Now, what about in California? Senior started with the Mountain View Cemetery during his years in California. That's in Oakland. You too can go there today. There is beautiful. You can walk the bucolic lanes overlooking downtown Oakland and the bay and that other big city across the bay in the distance, all designed by Senior during his years there. He also did the same thing, of course, in Stanford. It was a collaborative, a contentious relationship that he had with his client, Leland Stanford, but somehow the two of them managed to finally come up with a plan that they both compromised on and it worked, and it's considered perhaps the most cohesive, perfect campus plan in America, certainly of this generation of universities. Here are some examples of the Stanford campus. There's the chapel, here is the Hoover Tower maybe, and here is a nice overhead area. You can see how the campus completely holds together with all the buildings and all the grounds. Master planned by Senior, working with his Leland Stanford. Now, also, what about those hills above Berkeley? Berkeley Hills. Well, Junior came back because park community leaders in Berkeley and Oakland wanted him to come back to plan another park system. And he did. Here's the Tilden Regional Park in the hills above Berkeley. That's the historic one, but it's an entire system of 65 parks that he master planned. Well, now it contains 65. There wasn't that many when he first master planned it. 65 parks in the entire East Bay of semi-wild parks that circled the East Bay. The original version of this was master planned by Junior. He did the same thing for the state park system, considered one of the best in the nation. He actually planned it twice over the entire state park system there in California. And he proposed that the state, he says, hey, you have protected redwoods in the national parks. What about those state redwoods, like in the Santa Cruz Mountains? You got to protect those state redwoods. Well, here they are. Fortunately, as you all know, they were badly ravaged, some of them, in the fires in recent years. But there they are, the redwoods in the Santa Cruz Mountains. He also says, you have a beautiful desert. Protect it. Create the largest state park in the entire state of California. Here it is, the Anza Borrego Desert in blue. Largest state park in the state of California. all part of Olmsted's original recommendations. And then, in the 20th century, the Olmsted brothers found a place called Palos Verdes, 25,000 acres. They were brought in by the developers of the Palos Verdes estates to create one of the largest protected residential communities of its kind in America. Now, it may be perceived to be kind of a community for the well-heeled, and probably is, but it's not gated. And it has extensive parkland and trails that are open to all of the public of Greater LA and visitors from further afield. It's considered the most complex of all the projects that the Olmsted brothers ever worked on in terms of residential commissions, if you will. Now, what about here in the Great Lakes and the Upper Midwest, a little bit of the Upper Midwest as well. I'm going to start in Milwaukee, maybe, if this is allowed. Yes, there it is. There's Lake Park in Milwaukee. Actually, I think I have a vintage. There it is, Lake Park in Milwaukee, on the bluffs above Lake Michigan. It's considered the most perfect park in Milwaukee, but it's connected by a tree-lined boulevard, Newbury Boulevard, that leads to Riverside Park, which is in a gully or a gulch in the Milwaukee River, if you will. Kind of a wooded park. And Washington Park, which is further inland in a really, at this point in time, a working class community. So it's an entire, once again, integrated park system and parkways in Milwaukee. And then, wealthy Chicagoans, because of the fire, the Great Chicago Fire, and they needed to leave Chicago and have their homes rebuilt, they found a community called Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. And it has, it's beautiful, it's referred to as the Newport of the West. It has beautiful, not so small homes surrounding it. This is one of the larger mansions. But some of them actually have gardens designed by the Olmsted brothers, Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. It's actually closer to Milwaukee than it is Chicago, but it's considered a Chicago retreat. And, by the way, they just reopened the historic Yerkes Observatory. It's quite a cool place. I have visited. And they just restored and reopened the Olmsted Brothers Garden at the Yerkes Observatory. Now it's open to the public as a new historic park, reopened to the public after many years of closure. Pretty cool. It's on Williams Bay at the far end of Lake Geneva. And then you have Chicago, and I'm not going to try to avoid getting bogged down in too much detail, but by the way, Washington Park and Jackson Park pre-existed before Daniel Burnham hired Olmsted to come in and design the White City. Now, Washington Park had almost been completely designed. Jackson Park was still a work in progress, and there's the Midway Plaisance, as we now know, connecting the two parks. But he, of course, Burnham did bring Olmsted in, and he, of course, made many changes as the White City was being developed with the new lakes and canals, including even Venetian-style gondolas in the canals. Some of you know this. It was quite the place back then, as I said, kind of a complete utopian fantasy, but it certainly was very cool. No doubt about it. And one of the things that does remain, and thankfully the City of Chicago Parks Department has recently restored it, so it's a jewel once again, is the Japanese Garden in Jackson Park. And the only building that remains, some of you know this, is the Museum of Science and Industry here at Jackson Park today. By the way, controversially, some of you know the Obama Presidential Library is being built on a portion of this park, and there's some controversy surrounding that, but I've tried to stay out of it. But there have been those in the Olmsted community who have been very outspoken about it. But there's Jackson Park today, and I think I have an image of Washington Park for you. There's, whoops. Well, that's a famous sculpture. Let's bring Washington Park back if we can. There it is. There's Washington Park. It's not in as good a shape as is Jackson Park, but it's still quite beautiful. Parks Department is putting more love and attention into Washington Park as well. The sculpture, it's a pretty amazing sculpture. It's on the Midway Plaisance from 1922, the Fountain of Time by Laredo Tap. And by the way, later in the 20th century, let's go back to that. Later in the 20th century, the Olmsted brothers came in and built a whole new ring of parks, the outer ring of parks in Chicago. So Olmsted Sr. and Olmsted brothers all had extensive involvement there at Chicago over decades of time. By the way, some of you probably know this, but it was just finally announced, although the rumor has been spreading for a while. The Devil of the White City is greenlit, it's soon to be under production. It's going to be a 4 to 6 hour limited dramatic series on Hulu, executive produced by Martin Scorsese, Leonardo DiCaprio. Keanu Reeves is slated, of all things, to play Daniel Burnham. even in a play, H.H. Holmes, the heinous devil character in that book. But we're all looking forward to it. As of yet, they haven't announced anyone else. We don't know who's going to be playing in Olmsted. But the advance information tells us that the story will be focused on the experience of the World Columbian Exposition at this time through the eyes and experiences of two individuals, three really, leaving aside the devil. Who are the other two? Daniel Burnham and Frederick Olmsted. So we know he's going to be a major character in this series. We're looking forward to that when it comes out. So what about Riverside? A little bit more about Riverside. Here it is again. Some random images for you. Riverside scenes. Usually, let's bring that back, one back. Here's some Riverside scenes. So bucolic, so beautiful. Ample setbacks, curved linear streets, parkways, beautiful parkland trails, beautiful, beautiful suburb for this park west, about 13 miles west of Seattle. There's the famous water tower, seemingly coming out of the forest, although it's actually right next to a train station in the urban center, so I don't know how this photographer magically captured it. It's pretty cool. And then in Indianapolis, we're going to come east. Here's Indianapolis. This is the Lily House, formerly called Oldfields. Now it's part of Blue Fields Complex containing the Indianapolis Museum of Art. Here's the Ravine Garden designed by Percival Gallagher of the Olmsted Brothers. Here is the alley. And here is the gardens and another image of the house and gardens at the Blue Fields Complex in Indianapolis, all master plan designed by the Olmsted Brothers. We're going to go to Detroit. Here's Belle Isle Park. It's now a state park. It's undergoing a lot of restoration, as some of you know. I've been spending some time there in recent years, as I have at Niagara Falls. But it was Olmsted Sr. who was brought in, and he master planned Belle Isle Park. Here's a temporary map. I have one historic image. Here is Olmsted's plan for Belle Isle Park. By the way, the largest island park in America, one of the largest city parks in America. It's actually larger in acreage than is Central Park, by the way. Here's the promenade, 1910. Here are the canals that Olmsted designed in the early 1900s. It's had its ups and downs, as many urban parks have, but again, the state of Michigan and the DNR, Department of Natural Resources, is putting a lot of money and effort into making improvements at Belle Isle. Here's the other items were added after Olmsted time, including the manuscripts with the conservatory on Belle Isle. I like this picture. It really stands out for its beauty. So that's Belle Isle. What about, and here's one final picture of Belle Isle. What about Cleveland? I was just there, literally just come from there. Here's the Fine Arts Garden, immediately adjacent to the Cleveland Art Museum, not the Cleveland Institute of Art, sorry, that's an error, the Cleveland Museum of Art. This is Olmsted Jr., this is the Olmsted Brothers. Here is another picture of the fountain of the Fine Arts Garden. Here is yet one more picture of that beautiful garden in bloom in the spring. And then we have Rochester, where I will be starting tomorrow for the next 2 days. Highland Park is the most well-known of all the parks in Rochester, but we also have Genesee Valley Park and Seneca Park, and there's one other park that's part of the integrated master plan, Olmsted Park system for the entire city of Rochester. That will be Maplewood Park, by the way. So Rochester followed on the heel of Buffalo with an entire Olmsted Senior master plan park system. And then you have Utica, not so well known, an unheralded collection of Olmsted parks in Utica. Here's Roscoe Mountain Park. Here is F.T. Proctor Park. And by the way, there's 4 Olmsted Brothers parks in the city of Utica. They're raising money, they're restoring them as we speak. It's pretty cool, finally. And it's a little city without a lot of money, but they're actually doing it, they're trying to do it. Then, and Memorial Parkway. There's also a parkway in Utica. Then you come back to Buffalo, because there are other Olmsted parks in Buffalo, not just Front Park and famously Delaware Park. There's what was called Humboldt Park, now it's Martin Luther King Park. All of you know this. There are the children on the splash pad in the hot summer stage fountain. And there's also the Botanical Gardens in South. Now, the Botanical Gardens came after Olmsted's time, but South Park was part of his initial master plan. And as you know, I think they've just raised funds or just announced finally that they're going to be doing some serious restoration work on these botanical gardens. Cazenovia Park also came subsequently, as did 1 or 2 other parks. But there are many Olmsted parks, generations of Olmsteds working in Buffalo. And finally, we come to Niagara Falls. Now, I, again, am surrounded by experts. And I'm going to call your attention to 2 things. I already mentioned the fact that the The state parks has a beautiful new interpretive series of panels, if you will, in the antechamber, if you will, to the multimedia experience for Cave of the Winds. And if you haven't yet been to that whole experience, I highly recommend it. You don't have to take the elevator down to actually do the Cave of the Winds. You can just do the above ground portion, right, Angela? Which is what I did today. So I highly recommend it. And boy, I even learned a few things there today. Now, we started, of course, here's the Mill District. By the way, I borrowed some of your pictures with your permission, Angela, from this interpretation. This is the back of the buildings along American Rapids. Here is Sluice. Here is hiding the view of the falls. You know, literally, you couldn't see the falls back then unless you paid what was called a commutation fee. Some quality of this. It was really hidden from view for the general public unless you paid a fee to see a small section of the natural waterfall. And the Free Niagara Association was started along with Olmsted leadership and Dwarsheimer and all of the other leading figures of the day. And they took a famous walk out on Goat Island. They took a famous walk on Goat Island and they imagined what it could be if they returned it to its natural state. And they started the Free Niagara Association, the first big national campaign for scenic preservation. Now, there's an article on the WBFO website by a radio piece produced by Jeff Z. Klein for the Niagara Frontier Heritage Project. And I always give credit to my peers who do a better job of covering something than I could possibly do. So I highly encourage you to go to that page on the WBFO website. It's from 2018. You can listen to the story, you can read his text. The title of it is Frederick Olmsted and the Scroll That Saved Niagara. And it's rich in detail, it's great. About how Dwarsheimer and H.H. Richardson and Frederick Olmsted and other leading citizens of the day gathered together, including, by the way, eventually, novelist Henry James, the Governor General candidate, Lord Dufferin, William Morris, the founder of the Arts and Crafts Movement, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Thomas Carlyle, John Ruskin, and Charles Darwin, as well as landscape painter Frederick Edwin Church. All were parts of the Free Niagara, members of the Free Niagara Association, calling on the newly elected governor of New York, Grover Cleveland, to bring about some changes. So in 1883, the Niagara Falls State Reservation was created by the legislature, and it is now, as you all know, the oldest state park in the nation. Here's the campaign to save Niagara. These are citizens on their way to Washington, D.C. to campaign to save Niagara. Here is the grand vision for Niagara, as you will read about it if you go to the new visitor center that I just referred to. There's a lot of detail in that one panel. Here is Olmsted and Fox's own design for Goat Island. They did design Goat Island, and it was their pride and glory. And you all have been there. Take the first bridge out to Goat Island. There's a series of bridges that you know to Goat Island, and then to maybe make it work. The Three Sisters, and sorry about that, they're going in a different order. But I actually just took this picture today. This is the rapids from Three Sisters. This is from the third sister, that is, looking at the rapids on the Canadian side. And here is American Falls. I also just took this picture today. And here is another picture in overhead area of Niagara Falls State Park. What a masterpiece with a genuine Olmsted imprint. And you should be proud of that Olmsted heritage here. It is something else. I'm going to finally bring this to a close. You're wondering when I'm going to get there. During this past couple of years of COVID quarantine and social distancing, public parks have been a lifesaver for so many of us seeking fresh air, exercise, physical and psychological health. You could say that Olmsted was ahead of his time as he emphasized public health, mental health, and taking it even further, the spiritual health benefits of public parks for everyone in a democracy. As we commemorate Olmsted's senior's birthday, and here's an additional picture of Niagara Falls and Goat Island. As we commemorate Olmsted's senior's birthday and the Olmsted landscape design legacy during 2022, we also highlight the ever more crucial role that public parks play in our lives. Needless to say, COVID and social and environmental justice movements have only greatly underlined that very fact, and the urgent need to provide more green space, to distribute it equitably, and to make all such spaces accessible and inviting to all. In fact, it isn't too much of a stretch to say that that was Frederick Law Olmsted's agenda from the very start, I and others would argue. So, that Niagara Falls slide was out of place. That was meant to go here, but at this point when I'm speaking elsewhere, I usually tell folks, hey, Once COVID is behind us, take another road trip across America. Revisit cities you've never been to, or revisit cities you haven't been to in a long time, and maybe visit cities that you've never been to before, because I'm often presenting this in other parts of the country. And I tell them, you got to go visit the so-called Rust Belt cities of America to learn about their extraordinary history and culture, and the parks that exist in pretty much all of them that Frederick Olmsted designed. So finally, leaving you with two thoughts. I'm going to have to leave this picture up. You know this picture now. We're going to let Daniel Burnham, the driving force of the World Columbian Exposition, close out this program. When the World's Fair was set to open in 1893 at a dinner with all the artists and architects gathered to laud Burnham for his extraordinary efforts, big-egoed Burnham deferred, demurred, pivoted to the side. There was Olmsted, crumpled, facing his physical infirmities, sitting quietly near him at the banquet table, and Burnham pivoted and pointed in Olmsted's direction, and he said this: each of you knows the name and genius of him who stands first in the heart and confidence of American artists, the creator of your own parks. It is he who has been our best advisor and our constant mentor, Frederick Olmsted, an artist. He paints with lakes and wooded slopes, with lawns and banks and forest-covered hills, with mountainsides and ocean views. He should stand where I do tonight, not for the deeds of later years alone, but for what his brain hath wrought and his pen has taught for half a century. Finally, in Olmsted's own words. Isn't this a great picture? It's from the Boston Globe. In Olmsted's own words, the beauty of the park should be the beauty of the fields, the meadow, the prairie, the green pastures, and the still waters. What we want to gain is tranquility and rest to the mind. Is it doubtful that it does men good to come together this way, in pure air and under the light of heaven? Seems to me that prescription, if you will, rings as loudly today in 2022 as it did in the late 19th century. Thank you, Frederick Olmsted and Sons. And thanks for all of you for your attention today. Thanks for bearing with me in this longish program this evening. I appreciate you coming out, everyone. I'm happy to take questions. Thank you. Kind of a hot, humid day. The whole run of them here in this part of the country hasn't. So thanks for coming out this evening, this day in August. And if I have any errors of commission or omission with regards to Niagara Falls, I apologize. I'm sure I will be corrected out of them. But by the way, I'm going to be providing to Angela. I don't know if she'll be able to distribute it, but I actually have a digital document that is an annotated list of all my recommended books about Olmsted, and including websites, including films. By the way, I'm going to leave you the URL of our WNED film, because the dedicated website is far different from what you would find by looking for it randomly at PBS or Amazon. There is much more on our dedicated website, additional video, and a whole slew of scholarly essays about the Olmsted legacy in America that you will not find by going to PBS or Amazon. And here is the URL, so feel free to take a shot of that if you can try to figure it out. There it is up top. That's the dedicated website, WNED website, that's still active for our film, Frederick Olmsted Designing America. And again, happy to take questions if there are any. I haven't exhausted you. Yes, hi.
Is there any connection between the Olmsted and Sierra Club?
Not directly, no. There is a direct connection, of course, with John Muir, needless to say. And by the way, I've done research into this, and I've even talked to the leading Olmsted scholar in America. And I even talked to the biographer, John Muir, and we haven't been able to determine whether their paths ever crossed. I have to assume that they were in Yosemite at approximately the same time, but we don't have any evidence that their paths ever crossed or that they knew and had any relationship with one another. So, and there's no relationship with Olmsted Senior and the Sierra Club. I don't know whether Junior might have had some contact with the Sierra Club, but there's no relationship with Senior. Other questions?
Could you speak for a moment about the influence that Olmsted had on so many college and university campuses?
Yeah, and I only showed one, didn't I? By the way, I just presented in Cleveland and I talked about the Ohio State University. Because first of all, Olmsted Senior and the Sons work on many private and public university and college campuses across America, as well as private schools, as well as public health hospitals and mental health hospitals. You saw one, the Buffalo Insane Asylum. So they have institutional campuses, more broadly, institutional campuses. In particular, they seem to have a real commitment to the Aggie schools, to the land-grant institutions. Probably, I've added them all up. I want to say about 50% of the land-grant institutions in America have some involvement of the Olmsted brothers. Maybe not quite 50%. It's somewhere between 1/3 and 33%, 50%. It just was in their, it was in their wheelhouse. That's what they did. And they certainly, father and sons, believed in higher education. Remember, the father was self-taught, a self-taught Renaissance man. Never attended college. He just audited classes at Yale, but he insisted that the two sons, one attended Yale, the other attended Harvard. And no doubt they were firm believers in higher ed. And it just was in their wheelhouse, and they wanted to create these beautiful campuses, which were conducive to learning, but also beautiful outdoor environments with buildings and scale to the landscape, so that they were beautiful environments for people to attend college and university. But with a particular interesting history with the land-grant institutions, but also many private, including Vassar, by the way, including Vassar. New York and New England have the greatest number of private institutions with Senior and the Olmsted brothers. The rest of the country, it's mostly Aggie schools other than Stanford. Yep, you bet. Yep.
Great presentation. Many people know of Frank Lloyd Wright.
Yeah.
And in Martin's book, he said that Olmsted may be the most important historical figure in America that the average person knows at least about.
Right.
What's your take on it?
Well, obviously my take is I would tend to agree, but you know, part of the whole point of this Olmsted 200 exercise this whole year is to bring that to prominence and to educate a wider public through any means possible. That was part of the reason for our film project at WNUD, was to make sure that we could get the word out to a wider public. You know, hundreds of thousands of eyes are watching these, at least in the heyday of public television. I don't know if it's quite like what it once was. But even as recently as 2014, when our film premiered, I think there were probably more eyes watching public television than there are now, although I'm not sure. Of course, now everything's online as well. You can see everything online. But that's kind of the reason why I'm on this speaking tour. I'm kind of the Johnny, even among those, there are Olmsted scholars who are far more authoritative than I am, and far more scholarly. And some of them are at least part, if not full-time academics. My whole point of going around the country to do this is I'm kind of the Johnny Appleseed, to get everyone up to speed with the extraordinary Renaissance man quality of this man's, the breadth and depth of this man's life and career. And I hope I've conveyed at least some feeling for that tonight. And I do agree with that comment, that's for sure. And I think Olmsted 200, that's hopefully one of the aftermaths. Results of Olmsted 200 is that word has now reached a wider public, that he's someone to contend with when it comes to America. That's why we call our film Olmsted, Frederick Olmsted. That's the title, well, it wasn't the title of this program, but sometimes I title the programs that Frederick Olmsted Designing America. Let's not forget also Canada, from Victoria to Calgary to Winnipeg to Montreal, also across Canada. Not nearly as prodigious, but significant influence in Canada as well. All the way down to Venezuela, by the way. All the way down to Venezuela, the Olmsted brothers.
Did he design parks in the Toronto area?
None in Toronto that I'm aware of. Good question, because I know, of course, Buffalo and Toronto are kind of sort of linked, aren't they? None in Toronto that I'm aware of. He seemed to have skipped over Toronto and Ottawa. He went from Winnipeg all the way to Montreal. Any other questions? Or we should, am I seeing I'm seeing something, take a picture of the website, great. Oh, those are my, by the way, sorry. But I'll be providing a digital version which will have much more detail than what you saw there. I wanted to leave that. Anyway, thank you again, everyone, for your kindness and your patience and your attention this evening. Thanks very much for coming. Thank you, David, for your wonderful technical assistance way up there in the balcony. Thanks, Dave.